Happy Monday, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. For those who don't know me, my name is Alexis Alvarez, and I'm the Director of Statewide Training at Florida Legal Services. Today, we are here for the third part of our Domestic Violence Awareness Month training series. This training series was developed with all of our partner speakers in order to honor this month of awareness and provide you all with not only your CLE credits, but all of the important information about the relevant topics that touch upon survivors. So today you are here to learn about the intersectionality of non-citizen survivors, domestic violence, and human trafficking for pro bono advocates. And before I go into introducing our wonderful speaker that we have here today, I'll go over some housekeeping announcements. First and foremost, this was approved for CLE credit. One general CLE credit. At the end of the presentation, I will pop that CLE code into the chat. I will also announce it out loud, and that CLE code will be included in an email within 24 hours of this event. That email will come from Zoom. It will not come from my direct email address, but I will put my email address into the chat for anyone who misses it, doesn't see it in their inbox, or just wants to reach out. Additionally, with that email from Zoom, you will receive a copy of this recording. You will also receive some materials that have been presented by shared by our presenter, and a PDF version of the PowerPoint. So be on the lookout for that email, and if you don't get it, always reach out to me. Second housekeeping announcement, please put your questions into the chat or the Q&A. Don't be shy. I know it can be tough when we live in the virtual vortex of webinars, but having a discussion and hearing your points of view and answering your questions is half the fun on our end over here. So please feel free to drop those into the chat or the Q&A, and we will monitor them and we will answer them. That way you're in the know. And I think that's the last housekeeping announcement, other than the fact that this is being recorded, obviously, and that live transcriptioning has been enabled. So there should be a black box at the bottom explaining transcribing everything that I'm saying. If you don't see that or you need help with that, just DM me in the chat separately and I'll troubleshoot with you. So without further ado, it is my extreme pleasure to introduce Nicole Avila. It's my pleasure because she's one of my brilliant colleagues at Florida Legal Services, a very good friend, and extremely knowledgeable about the topic that we're going to discuss today. So Nicole is a supervisory attorney at Florida Legal Services. Ms. Avila is part of Florida Legal Services Survivor Advocacy Team, where she provides wraparound legal services to survivors of human trafficking, domestic violence, and other crimes. Ms. Avila is an experienced immigration and victims' rights attorney. She joined FLS in October of 2020. Prior to joining FLS, Ms. Avila worked in private practice as an immigration attorney for a small firm and as a solo practitioner. Ms. Avila is a member of the National VAWA UNT Visa Committee of the American Immigration Lawyer Association, and is often featured as a speaker on statewide, local, and national panels, including for the American Immigration Lawyers Association, the American Bar Association, and the Freedom Network of the United States of America regarding immigration relief for survivors of crimes, human trafficking, trauma-informed representation, and immigration practice from a race equity lens. Without further ado, Nicole, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for speaking in our statewide training initiative, being a part of this important month, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Alexis. So thank you everybody for being here. So as Alexis said, we're going to talk about the intersection of domestic violence, human trafficking in the cases of non-citizen survivors of these crimes, with a focus on assisting folks providing pro bono representation to this client population. As Alexis said, I am Nicole. I am one of the supervisory attorneys in our survivor advocacy project here at Florida Legal Services, in our VOCA funded project and our OVC funded project, working with trafficking survivors, domestic violence survivors, and survivors of other crimes. And my pronouns are she, her. So primarily the objectives that we have with this training today is for folks to understand the legal definition of human trafficking, understanding the interplay between domestic violence and human trafficking cases, identifying those similarities in the interplay of those cases, the differences and nuances in cases that involve human trafficking, and incorporating our legal practice from an anti-trafficking lens. The concepts that we're stemming from to start with, the Department of Justice defines domestic violence as a pattern of abusive behavior in any relationship that is used by one partner to gain or maintain power and control over the other intimate partner. For human trafficking, this is the statutory definition under the federal statute. So sex trafficking in which a commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person induced to perform that act is under 18 years of age, or the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. Now, when we're talking about human trafficking, one of the things I want you to keep in mind is that human trafficking is primarily a crime against a person, not a crime against a border. So it's very different from when we're talking about smuggling and folks coming in through the border without inspection and things like that. There can be some overlap between those things, but they do not always mean the same thing. So here we're talking about crimes against a person. And one other caveat that I want to address, because I know it causes a lot of confusion, for human trafficking to occur, we're looking for somebody to gain something of value from the person that they're inducing into this labor. So we have to have some sort of forced labor, whether it is sex or some other form of labor, domestic labor, cleaning, nannying, things like that. There has to be some labor. And the other person has to be enriching from that labor in some way. We talk about something of value. It doesn't necessarily have to be money. It could be services. It could be food, anything like we talk about of value. It could obviously be money, but it doesn't have to be. So let's talk about the primary intersection of where domestic violence and human trafficking come together, so to speak. The National Network to End Domestic Violence highlights that there's a marked overlap in the pattern of behaviors that both abusers and traffickers exert to keep power and control over a victim. So if you've been doing any domestic violence work for any amount of time, you might be familiar already with the power and control wheel for domestic violence cases that's based on the Duluth model. So these are the types of ways that abusers will often exercise control over the survivor in domestic violence contexts. The Polaris Project, which is the National Human Trafficking Hotline, has adapted the DV power and control wheel for trafficking cases. So we can see here that many of those pieces of the wheel are the same, and the tactics that are often used to entice or keep folks within that trafficking scheme are very, very similar or the same. So the overlap happens throughout the entire scheme, and it might be because the trafficker is an intimate partner, and we're going to get into the types of overlap a little bit later. But this is where one of the things that I want to highlight, because we might come into contact with folks who identify as survivors of domestic violence, or who recognize that they have been coerced or induced to do certain things based on the tactics that we're familiar with under the wheel, and we might not immediately recognize that as human trafficking, and it doesn't always have to be, but it is important for us to understand trafficking and where that overlap happens, because trafficking survivors may have access to different resources, especially for non-citizens, that might not be available to domestic violence survivors, and so we want to keep an eye on that. So where do domestic violence and human trafficking intersect? There's three primary areas where they intersect. So domestic violence, or a lived experience of domestic violence, increases vulnerability for somebody with that lived experience for re-traumatization. So they may become more vulnerable to trafficking, and that is something that a trafficker could exploit. Conversely, somebody with lived experience of human trafficking victimization might have increased vulnerability for domestic violence. And then we have cases where both victimizations occur at the same time. And these you might see as referred to as intersection cases or crossover cases. And some examples I think of where we can see something like this. So in a case where somebody with a lived experience of human trafficking victimization might have possibly had involvement with commercial sex or something like that, that could be a tool for an abuser in a domestic violence situation to exercise control over the person in terms of threatening abuse of the legal process, threatening to withhold or take custody of any children, or, you know, I'm going to tell DCF that you've done all those things and these things are on the internet, and things of that nature. Similarly, like I said, when there's DV lived experience, any of that pre-existing trauma can be used to be exploited by a trafficker to exercise control over that victim. And I'll give some case examples of the co-occurring cases as we go forward. One thing that I think is very important to highlight, and especially in the client populations that we typically serve, this is a very powerful statement by Jean Brueggemann and Liz Keys. Their paper on meeting the legal needs of human trafficking survivors for domestic violence attorneys was written for the ABA, and it will be in the materials that Alexis is going to share with you later on. But where abuse intersects with poverty, human trafficking is more likely to occur. And the reason for that, and I know that for human trafficking, we oftentimes think of sex trafficking exclusively, but human trafficking does include both sex and labor trafficking. And when we're talking about folks that are in poverty and where the trauma and the abuse intersects with folks with this lived experience, they're more vulnerable to trafficking situations, and the traffickers are very well versed and adept at exploiting those vulnerabilities and telling folks, you know, we have this job opportunity, let's, you know, you can come in right away and this is how much we're going to pay you, and defrauding folks into a scheme where they'll later be exploited. So it's something that's important to keep in mind. This is a big intersection that I think we experience a lot with the types of clients and the client populations that we serve in legal aid, and that folks that are doing pro bono volunteer work might experience as well. So I want to talk about a little bit about those vulnerabilities that you might hear mentioned, not only by me, but in other trainings talking about human trafficking and domestic violence. So some of the things that folks who are in these schemes or may be more vulnerable to these schemes are prior victimization, poverty, lack of access to resources. If they were to leave a situation, criminalization of victims and survivors, especially when we're talking about sex work, that criminalization and the potential for engagement with law enforcement and incarceration keeps folks in schemes where they might otherwise be able to leave if they weren't facing those very severe repercussions. Fear of losing children, lack of a safety net or support system, and cultural or religious beliefs, either of the person in the scheme, the trafficker or the abuser, or even the folks that they're interacting with upon escape or attempted escape from those schemes. And all of these vulnerabilities that are present in many of the survivors that we serve are multiplied for folks who lack immigration status. They are especially vulnerable. They may not, there's going to be language access issues in addition to this, as well as the possibility of removal or deportation, increased fear of losing their children, because if they are removed, or the fear that they have of being removed, it means that they might not be able to come back. And the resources that are available are even fewer than what is available for folks who do have status in the United States. For instance, in the state of Florida, for access to public benefits, for the most part, folks have to have qualified immigrant status for 5 years before they can access a lot of the public benefits that are available. Which means that many of the folks who are undocumented or who are in the process of becoming documented, even through a victim-based form of relief, like relief under the Violence Against Women Act, or visas for victims of crimes, visas for trafficking survivors, might not have immediate access to some of these public benefits. Non-citizen survivors of human trafficking might have access to what's called TVAP, or the Trafficking Victims Assistance Program, through providers in the state, and that will enable them to access social services, some monetary assistance where available, and there's a lot of different services, including case management. One of the providers for that is going to be the International Rescue Committee, the IRC, and Lutheran Services of Florida is another provider locally. So those are folks that we can reach out to and send clients to that are non-citizens for those TVAP services and benefits that they might be able to access there. One note that I want to make on vulnerability, and I'm not going to read this whole thing to you, but I do urge you to read it. A lot of the training that we see with regards to human trafficking screenings and things like that relies on factors or red flags and spotting vulnerabilities and things like that. And it is a, let's say, a good starting point to do our analysis, but as advocates and attorneys serving this population, we need to be very aware that that is really just a starting point, and it doesn't tell us the whole picture. It can either over-identify or under-identify populations, so we need to be mindful of what we're looking for, the questions we're asking, and how we're asking them. Because, for instance, if you have a client who is very recently separated from the crisis situation, they might not be able to identify with all these statements that you're giving them or the questions that you're asking. They most of the time, we're not having folks walk into our office saying, I was human trafficked. So we have to be careful and mindful of the questions that we ask and how we ask them. Just because somebody responds no to the set of questions doesn't mean they haven't been trafficked. And just because they respond yes it doesn't necessarily mean there's trafficking. There might be abuse, there might be exploitation, but it doesn't always mean that there's trafficking. So keep in mind always that statutory definition that we talked about, that this is a crime against a person, that this is a crime primarily of exploitation against the person, and that the other person is gaining something from the person they're exploiting. So I'm going to give some practice pointers, some things that are easier for you to take back to your offices and implement, and some more, let's say, conceptual things that we need to keep in mind when we're working with these populations. And like Alexa said, if you have any questions, please just pop them into the Q&A as we go along, or into the chat. I'm happy to address your questions as they come up, as long as they're on the topic. And then we'll have a Q&A at the end as well. So the first three things I really want to share with you when we're talking about working with survivors generally, and more specifically with human trafficking survivors, we want to be sure that our practice is coming from a victim-centered approach, that we're using trauma-informed principles to guide our practice, and that we understand trauma and its effects on the brain, on the person. And what this means generally when we're talking about a victim-centered approach, it means we're empowering our survivors and working together with them. And of course, we know as attorneys that there are parts of our representation where the attorney has final say, but in terms of the things that the client gets to decide, empowering them to make those decisions, giving them enough information, and being transparent about the risks and the potential benefits of the decisions they might be able to make, and being really a tool to guide them to making decisions without making those decisions for them whenever possible. Of course, like I said, parts of the representation are guided by the attorney in terms of your strategy and the legal arguments that you're going to make and things like that, but your client should really be informed throughout the entire representation of why we're doing things a certain way, and being very open and collaborative and transparent about how the representation is going, why we might make certain determinations or use certain pieces of evidence and not others, and treating our survivors like a whole person. They're someone who has experienced trauma, but this isn't the only thing that they have experienced, and it is not the only thing happening in their lives. Our legal representation is a piece of their lives, and they might not be able to prioritize our representation all of the time. So keeping that in mind with how we communicate with folks and our language, how much flexibility we're able to give with meeting folks where they are, and how much time they're able to dedicate to our representation and working together to achieve the client's goals. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about what the trauma-informed principles are and how we can implement that into legal practice. So generally, and the University of Buffalo has a good write-up for social services and social workers about trauma-informed principles. So generally, when we talk about this, and I know it might be kind of a buzzword most recently, but it really is very, very important for us to take this to heart and implement it into our legal practice. So we're talking about ensuring physical and emotional safety of our clients. Now, of course, we are not in a therapeutic position to do some of these things. So that doesn't mean that the attorney is going to do all of this, but that we're going to connect folks to social services to help them reach that point where they're feeling safe, safety planning with DV shelters when appropriate, and providing those resources and those tools so that folks can reach that point of safety. If they're not feeling safe and they're not in a position to go forward with this legal representation that might involve engaging with law enforcement and different systems of different legal systems throughout, especially recently after the victimization, or maybe they're still within the victimization scheme. So we have to assist in getting them to that place of physical safety and emotional safety. What this means for us, though, more practically, is when we're meeting with clients, whether it be remotely or in person, and I do think this is easier to do in person, but providing a space that feels safe for them to speak with us, where confidentiality is observed very carefully, providing things that might ease anxiety. Oftentimes when I'm meeting with clients in person or we're hosting clinics, we'll have available like fidget toys or putty, slime, things like that, that allow the client to kind of ground themselves with sensory things that they can squish or click to help ease anxiety and help with not, this process is going to be re-traumatizing no matter what because of the nature of the legal process, but we have to really take as many steps as we can to minimize that re-traumatization. Choice. So we want, like we talked about a little bit earlier, we want to have the client have choice and control over the parts of the representation that they can own, whether or not we're going to engage with law enforcement. The client gets to decide whether and how they want to engage with law enforcement. This is crucial for non-citizen clients because when we're talking about a T visa, for instance, which is a visa for survivors of trafficking, that visa, if the person who underwent the victimization is not a minor, they have a duty to report unless the trauma is so severe that they physically just literally cannot report. And there are certain benefits that come into play, like they're able to get a green card earlier if they do report to law enforcement once the investigation is concluded. So it is an important consideration to have, but it may not be something that the client is willing or able to engage in at any point in the representation, and that's okay. It might mean that we're not able to get a T visa for that client, but it really is a decision that belongs to them. Engaging with law enforcement, once we report, it really is out of our hands how law enforcement, what they will do with that information, whether it will go all the way through the criminal legal system. And it could have very severe consequences for our client. They fear retaliation from the trafficker or their network. So it is something that has to be taken delicately. And when the client makes that choice, that we're able to say, okay, this is what that means for your case, but that we're not using our power as an attorney to get the client to do something because that's how we think it should be done. It's really important for us as attorneys to keep in mind that there's always a power differential inherent in the attorney-client relationship. And because, like we talked about, domestic violence and human trafficking are both victimizations that involve exercising power and control over another person. Sometimes the way that we communicate or the way that we guide the relationship might recall the client back to that victimization. And we want to make sure that we're tracking to safety, not tracking to danger. And providing a way for them to make informed choices is one of those ways. But we do have to be mindful of our language to make sure that we're empowering the client to make the choices for themselves and not because they think that the attorney thinks they should do something. Again, collaboration, so making decisions with the client and keeping in mind, again, that power differential. What we say as attorneys, our clients might really take to heart. And so we want to be able to collaborate with them in making those decisions and providing guidance and information so that they are able to make an informed decision about their case. This one, it's number 4, but I think it really should be number 1, maybe number 2. Transparency, clarity, consistency, and boundaries. This is absolutely crucial, and this starts from the beginning of our representation, from the beginning of our meeting with the client, explaining what confidentiality is, what it applies to, if there are any points at which the confidentiality might not apply, who you'll be sharing information with and for what purpose, and being clear and consistent and transparent about the extent of the representation, things that might end the representation, and that goes from before we even sign a retainer, and explaining, of course, timelines are difficult, especially when we're talking about immigration and filing things. Things could take a long time, but being clear with the client that we expect things to take a certain amount of time. If that changes, letting them know where if they're tech savvy, where they can check processing times, and being as open as possible about the ins and outs of the representation, and what, especially with information sharing, if we're working in multidisciplinary teams, so there's perhaps a case manager that's working with them on the social services end, and we might have to share some information, informing the client and getting their permission to share the information, what type of information they're okay with us sharing, and letting them know why that information is necessary to be shared. Same thing when we're engaging with law enforcement. So when we're working with someone who does want to report to law enforcement, in the T visa context, for instance, or in any context really for human trafficking survivors, I generally act not only as their immigration attorney, but their victim rights attorney as well. Florida does have victim rights that attach at victimization that are constitutional under our state constitution. And so I act as the point person to connect them with the law enforcement agency that might be investigating the case. And we make the report de-identified typically at the beginning. And then they'll get back to us and say, yes, we're interested in investigating this. No, we don't think it sounds like trafficking or that we can do anything about it. But once we give that information to them, it really is out of our hands. And then if they do take on the report and want to investigate, there might be interviews and further engagement with law enforcement and possibly the criminal legal process. So we want to make sure that we're acting as victim rights attorneys if we're licensed in the state in which we practice, if not, engaging someone else to be their victim's rights attorney to make sure that their rights to be treated with respect and dignity, to be informed of at every stage of the criminal proceedings, that their information remains confidential in terms of the information that can be used to harass them, their address and things like that, that all those constitutional rights that are available to them are enforced, and that they have someone throughout the process to guide them and hold their hand. We deal with the legal process a lot, but most folks don't, unless they absolutely have to. And it is a complicated process, and it is going to be re-traumatizing. So having a victim rights attorney to ensure that the rights that are enforceable are enforced throughout the proceedings is a very important step as well. And that also goes to the empowerment portion. Having the attorney there throughout the victim rights proceedings or the criminal legal process, acting as a victim rights attorney, is a tool for the client to be able to use their voice, provide perhaps a victim impact statement if they're interested in doing that, whether they write it or read it into the record or have the attorney read it for them, whatever their comfort level is at that point. That is one of the resources that we can provide to promote the independence and autonomy of the client throughout the legal process. Connecting them with social services, like we talked about previously, is also an important piece. And for non-citizen survivors, the sooner we're able to get an employment authorization document so that they can start participating in the formal economy if they choose to, and it enables them to try and avoid further exploitation by being able to work with authorization and not be subject to folks who will offer positions that are maybe not all there cracked up to be, so to speak, or not paying what they promised they would pay, and it enables the client to move forward from the victimization and start putting those pieces together to become independent from this victimization. And while this Buffalo or University of Buffalo resource that I mentioned is a great resource, I don't think it goes quite far enough. So there is another resource that I'll share with you as well that talks a little bit more in a more complete framework. So all of those things are super important, but one thing that's missing from that framework is the system in which we work. So we have to keep in mind cultural, historical, and gender issues when we're working with these folks that have been traumatized and victimized. There's a cultural component, one piece of which is language access. So if the attorney is bilingual, or you're able to provide language access through a translator, making sure that there are pieces of the representation that the client might not be willing to engage in because of cultural issues. And it's important to keep that in mind and explain why that would be an obstacle to potential goals. But that is, at the end of the day, the client's decision to make in how far they engage with different things. The historical context as well. I often explain to colleagues when we're talking about similar issues. For instance, when we're talking about indigenous populations from Guatemala, they have been victimized for centuries, and they continue to be victimized in Guatemala. So someone like me is not necessarily going to track to safety upon them meeting me, and not for a while at the beginning of that representation, because while I am also Latina, I am not indigenous, and I do not speak an indigenous language. And so we can provide language access through an interpreter, and keeping in mind that our clients might not want to self-identify as indigenous because they have faced so many obstacles in home country from identifying as indigenous. They do often speak at least some Spanish, but that is not their first language. And I've encountered many folks who are embarrassed to say that they speak a different language. And trying to explain that we can proceed in Spanish, but if at any time there's anything that I say that I'm not clear about, then please let me know so that I can rephrase it, or at any time I can contact this service and we can have somebody that will translate everything that I say into the language that you speak the best, so that we make sure we're all on the same page. And I think that is crucial, because having the legal process explained in one's own language, I think, goes a very long way towards that transparency principle, and towards having the proceeding be fundamentally just fair and keeping in with due process. Now that might be an obstacle in certain cases, just because indigenous languages are many. And for instance, mom is an umbrella term that encompasses about 100 different languages. And so folks from different areas geographically in Guatemala, while they all speak mom, they don't speak the same mom. So we've run into issues in the past where we've gotten one interpreter that our client didn't understand as well. So we try as much as possible to get the interpreter that we need. And I think that is one of the biggest things for our clients, and just keeping in mind that the system, not only the system they're involved in now being in the United States, but the system that they come from is also fundamentally unfair and very racialized in many ways, and taking agency away from Indigenous populations. So keeping that in mind and understanding that the trauma might be compounded by the system that they've been engaged in at home, and that they now have to engage in the United States, and having to, when we're talking about immigration, for instance, when we're explaining for the T visa, one of the elements that we have to explain is that they would experience extreme hardship if they have to return to home country. And so having to explain what that hardship would be, and the lack of access to resources and things like that, not from our point of view as somebody in the United States, but from our client's point of view, and not maligning or painting a picture that comes from kind of a colonizer standpoint, and not painting with broad brush strokes how our client would experience hardship in home country. So keeping that historical context and how those systems of oppression have compounded and contributed to the trauma that our clients are experiencing, and how these the processes that we're engaging in might be additionally traumatic, and how we can participate in the systems in a way that reduces that chance for re-traumatization, or reduces the re-traumatization. And while we know that folks of all genders are victims of domestic violence or human trafficking, it is an issue that does affect folks that are that present as female, so with more frequency than folks who present as male. So it is a gendered issue in some cases, and depending on the type of work that they've been made to perform. Whether it be sex work or domestic servitude and things like that. Those are things to keep in mind, again, with contextualizing not only the legal representation, but the trauma and the victimization that your client has undergone within the context of the systems of oppression and the historical context of the population that they belong within. This resource I really love on applying person-centered and trauma-informed practices in the legal sphere, because oftentimes we hear, yes, of course we should practice in a trauma-informed way, but what does that mean in a practical sense? What do we say? What is it that we're trying to avoid? And we'll provide this this resource as well. This was prepared by Project Trust, and who's another OVC grantee, and it's a really great roadmap on how we can support our clients' trauma responses in the legal setting. So one of the things, and I think I mentioned earlier on what flexibility we're able to afford our clients, I often hear, and we see it here on the second column on supporting behavioral responses, avoiding threatening termination of services as punishment. And I hear this a lot from colleagues mainly in the private arena, but I've heard it from colleagues everywhere. And it might be, in some instances, it might be appropriate depending on what the background is, but we need to understand the effects of trauma on the client and on their brain and why they're responding in a certain way. Are there things that we are not taking into account? Let's say that the client is always late to our meetings, or that they're not able to provide documents on time. Are there things that we're not taking into account? Do they have childcare? Do they have reliable transportation? We live in Florida, there's very little public transportation, so it's very difficult. Do they have access to paying for an Uber? Do they have a phone to ask for an Uber? Things like that, and trying to overcome those obstacles to help the client be able to be a participant in the representation. We can set our own boundaries and talk about what the issues are and how this hinders the representation, and what we might and might not be able to do with the things that are missing, or with the client not being able to come to the meetings. But working in a collaborative way to and being approachable and frank with the client and explaining, this is what we need to do. How can we help you make this happen? Is it something I try very hard to avoid working late, but our clients have much less job security than we have, and taking a day off might mean losing their job. So if perhaps we can plan ahead to meet a little bit later after work, so that they have childcare at that time, the kids are home from school, they're not worried about having to go pick them up, and they can meet with us perhaps at 6 or 7 p.m. if it's necessary. Again, I tried to avoid that for my own personal boundaries, and keeping work and home separate, and our own self-care, but trying to come up with ways that we can be a little bit more flexible, or trying to troubleshoot the issues with the client, because again, we have the power in the relationship by virtue of our degree and our career. So the client might not feel comfortable saying, I can't make that, or I can't do that, I can't provide that because of XYZ reason. So trying to overcome those reasons. And I think that's a big example of something that I hear often in the field, that might be coming from a trauma exposure response. And so there's things that it's possible that when we're meeting with the clients, that they might express frustration in a way that we don't like or appreciate, and keeping in mind that it's not necessarily us, but there are trauma responses. There is something that's triggering that response, and that is the basis of trauma-informed representation, is understanding that everyone that we meet with might have a trauma history, whether it is as severe as human trafficking or domestic violence, or it isn't, but there are things that are going to trigger different responses. So I really encourage you to take a look at this resource, and we'll provide it for you so you can have it handy. And some more palpable, I guess, or tangible processes that you might be able to bring back to your organizations or your firms is redoing or reviewing your intake procedures to ensure that you're including questions about forced labor. And again, with the caveat that we're not going to stop at screening because I found XYZ red flag, and of course that must be trafficking. The ABA resource that I mentioned earlier by Jean Brueggemann and Liz Keys is in the materials, and on page 11 they have a list of questions that you can look at as an example of what we can do to include questions into our own screening materials. And there's also a resource from Vera that it's their screening procedures, but it's a good guide on how to use those. Building out a human trafficking referral network so that we can connect clients to the services that they need. We can only take care of the legal portion and connect them to other services. We're not going to be able to be the case manager and the therapist and provide financial assistance and everything else that they might need. So we want to connect them with a network of providers that can provide and serve all of those other needs aside from legal that they might have. And you might be thinking, well, I don't have that network right now. Where am I going to start? So there's local coalitions, there's county coalitions and statewide ones. There are task forces all over the state that might encompass one or a few counties, depending. Right here at Florida Legal Services, we have 2 projects that primarily work with human trafficking survivors. So we have our VOCA funded project, and we have our human trafficking legal services project under that's OVC granted, and that serves the Central Florida area. And our VOCA project serves statewide. So you can always connect the clients with us, and we do have a network of providers that we can connect them to. Farm worker associations, trafficking victim assistance program providers, like I mentioned, IRC and Lutheran Services of Florida are some of the providers that we have locally. We also, if you are doing pro bono cases, as long as we don't have a conflict within our own system, we're happy to provide assistance and mentorship and help you throughout that representation to make sure that the legal services that you provide are the best of, for your client, and that you can get the best outcome closest to their goal if possible. Sorry about that. And so those are my my biggest kind of takeaways for things that you can do to implement in your processes right now. Some of the technical assistance and training providers that I would recommend accessing are CAST, the Coalition Against Slavery and Trafficking. They have an enormous database of all sorts of anti-trafficking lawyering, trauma-informed lawyering, and if you take one of their web courses, you get access to their database of samples and for declarations, letters, and everything like that. And again, if you were to take either a case that we place through FLS, or you approach us with a case that you are doing pro bono that we can co-counsel on, then we can assist with that and provide mentorship and guidance to you. I'm going to put my contact information back up in case you need to take it down. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have now, or if you want to reach out later by email, anything that I've forgotten to say or that you want to know more about.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nicole. It's always a pleasure to listen to you, and really the client-centered, client-first approach that you take with such empathy and as much empathy as it allows, because I know we can never say we understand the shoes that somebody else walks in, but it's really refreshing always to hear just the passion in your voice and the respect that you have so much for our survivor community and your clients. So I really appreciate that. In the meantime, while folks are thinking of any last minute questions they might have, I am going to drop the CLE code into the chat and maybe some other information. I will say that the resources that Nicole mentioned, I did put a link into the chat earlier. That link will also be included in the follow-up email, so don't worry, you'll get it if you don't have the ability to access it now. Also popping into the chat that this training was approved by the Florida Bar for 1 general CLE credit. That code is 2208893, N as in Nancy. Again, you will receive that code in an email in 24 hours, so don't worry. And my email address is there in the chat if anybody doesn't get that email from Zoom and wants to reach out for a copy of the recording and any materials. I feel like there was something else that I was going to drop in the chat. I got too distracted listening to all of the great information that you provided us. And without any questions in the chat right now, okay, we've got something from Nicole. Do you want to talk about what this is? I know you already mentioned it, but just highlight what it is.
Yes, so this is the handout from Project Trust that talks about the changing our language and how we apply that person-centered and trauma-informed into our practice and how we talk to our clients and what their responses, how we manage those responses.
Awesome. Thank you so much for providing that. You know, the resources are invaluable, and I know many folks go back, access them, and look at them when they get a chance. And so I think actually I remembered what I forgot. You know, this training was part of a Domestic Violence Awareness Month training series. And the next training in this series is on Friday, and that is going to encompass family law, dependency law, and how that intersects with, you know, our survivor work. So the link for that registration will also be in the follow-up email from Zoom. So keep an eye out, and we hope to see you there. And without that, if anyone doesn't have any questions, there's a comment. I do like reading those. It says, "Thank you so much for this refresher on this topic. Can never know enough about this crucially important topic and appreciate you providing this and all this information." So thank you. And thank you, Nicole. Thank you for everyone for being here. It takes two to tango. You have someone who provides the information, and you have, you know, all of the fighters out there who go in and implement it. So we're a team, we're a community, and I appreciate you all for joining us up at the statewide training initiative to learn about this important topic. And Nicole, anything else before we sign off?
Nope, that's it for me. Thank you, Alexis. Thank you, everybody.
Awesome. Everyone have a wonderful rest of your Monday. It is Monday, right? And and we'll see you at the next one.
Thank you.